And so that's the same thing we're doing over here. This is simple. We'll write on there, simple, complex. Today I'm going to do a little discussion on designing items and props. This is based on a lot of stuff I've learned from entertainment design classes I've taken, along with just some general entertainment design info that I've studied and looked up a lot. So I'm going to go through some of the design rules that I think about, and also kind of showing ideally like a shift in a drawing of this mask that's kind of realistic, and then one that's like a little bit more pushed, and like even some different ways we can push it. If I have some time too, I'd love to do like a little render, even kind of like riff and invent off of it. So first, let's write down on here. This is a West African mask. So I think mask work and a lot of different types of wear, like things that people would wear or employ, those are always great because eventually if you design something like this, you could even give it context, like putting it onto a person. And of course, even inventing off of it, which would be a really great thing to do as well, especially if we took like a couple of these and kind of blended them together. There's 3 design rules that I'm going to think about, and I'll probably bring up some along the way. But the main ones that I want to think about, actually, I'll keep them down here. I'm going to double check that everything's looking good on the stream. Okay, cool. So yeah, the 3 main rules I'm going to think about are, first, simple versus complex. So this can be across sides. It can be inside of the image itself. So meaning like it could be the left and right of the image. It could be inside of, like in this case with the mask, like the interior info, right? It's a contrast that we're trying to create between areas that are simple and then ones that are more complex. And another way I sometimes talk about this, especially when we're talking about like up and down a character or an item, would be like chaos versus rest is another way to think of it. So I'll put that on there as well. And we'll put it in the same order. So yeah, like rest versus chaos. Okay. The next thing I want to put on here as a design rule is a center line. So meaning to promote the volume in this shape and in my item, I want to give it some kind of visual cues like CUE to give it a center, which in this case, I'll pan up here for a second. This is great. This is like a perfect example. Let me circle right there of a center line, like a piece we can use in this shape to show the center, and then also to turn that volume, like turn this shape and still keep the center acknowledged. Okay, and then the last thing, of course, a very important design rule, would be big, medium, small. Now, this isn't a hierarchy, meaning like this is not a specific order. You don't have to go in this order. But the idea being that we want to space things out across this mask, and especially portions of it, like the bottom and the top, is big, medium, and small. And the more we contrast those, of course, the more we have a style, like we're kind of like stylizing or pushing it, and we can like turn the volume on that. We can make the big, medium, small kind of subtle, or we can make it like really, really dramatic, and we'll try to show a little bit of that. And I think in theory, again, with all these rules, we can apply all of them into one drawing, and then even separately we can sort of isolate it. So why don't we start with sort of like a realistic version of this. This would be a very quick sketch, but the idea would be, okay, here's like no real like design, just basically like a one-to-one translation, which is cool too, because then we could see how we would design something like this. So the first thing I react to, of course, is kind of this nice oval shape. It's like a really like stretched out egg. And of course, that's great because it's a mask, and so in theory, it should have some context for humans, right? Like it should have some sort of reference to the human body or the human face. And we can often simplify the human head into a shape like that, right? Like an egg. I would want to find a center, right? So I'll put a little bit of a center on there. There's like a dip, which is nice too. This is going to be interesting to play with later. So there's like a dip. There's a nose. These asymmetrical eyes, it looks like the axis on them is kind of tilted. Very cool. That's a really nice thing to work with later on. Here's the mouth. A lot of times, I know there's probably some different orders, but a lot of times I start with the actual like lip or opening itself. I don't know if people do this sometimes where they start with like the whole shape, but I would usually start with like the mouth or the lips opening and then put the actual lip on there. It's a very sharp ending down here. Okay, and then to wrap up the sketch, I will acknowledge like this is a ridge, right? This physical piece that sticks out. And then kind of like these rays, almost like sun rays on the top. So the first thing I would do is I would just kind of acknowledge the space they occupy. And then I would try to have some faith to the quantity. So I'd say to myself, okay, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13. I'm actually going to do that again because that'd be interesting if it was asymmetrical or not even. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13. Yeah, 13. So the cool thing would be, let me find the center, right? Like right here. And I'll tell myself, okay, there's one there. And so what's on the left and the right? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So that makes sense, actually. There's like a center piece and then 6 on each side. And I would usually plot the axis first, like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And then same thing, of course, over here. 1, 2, 3. Don't forget to like swing and walk, meaning like if you see this is number 3 over here, you can kind of, with your eyes or even with the pencil, swing and walk over here so that they're matching up, that they're somewhat even. So you can't see me doing it physically, but even like on the tablet or kind of like with my eye, I'm sort of like using my eyes to swing from one side over here to the other. And the verb I usually refer that to, or like kind of the term is, I call it a walk up. So meaning like, if two things are existing on either side, walk them up a little bit. Okay. And then there's like some small stuff I'd want to do on here, like kind of fix these volumes a little, but this would be a translation, like for the most part, like a one-to-one kind of translation of this. There's really no innovation on it. And that's good for an observational drawing, right? So meaning something that is a documentation of this, right? That's even why counting is so important, because we'd say, oh, I'd really like to very, accurately document this shape and be faithful to it. So this is an observational drawing. It's documenting it. And then it's also realistic in theory, meaning it's not quite stylized. It's got like basically the realistic idea of what I see in front of me. Here's these ridges. This is why it's so good to build the axis first, because then you can just go down the line, build on each one. And I think when we're first starting out in drawing and design, this can be a little bit fatiguing, like even just counting or trying to like make sure you have everything. That's why sometimes we skip that, or we sort of jump ahead and we're not super accurate. But I think once you break it down into simple shapes, even things like this axis before you draw, this little center line before you draw things and their completion, you'll realize it's not that hard. It's like ultimately something that might feel or sound fatiguing is actually not that big a deal. And again, there's some stuff I'd change on here. Like I know the top could be a little bit taller. Let's go ahead and just use our digital means. So this is definitely okay to grab it with your lasso tool and bring it down a little bit. Yeah, I like that, for instance, a lot more. I tried to do a lot of things straight up, meaning like, oh, if I need to redraw, like I'll erase, just like I would traditionally. But there is a point where it's kind of masochistic, right? Meaning like, oh, I could just use like a lasso tool and fix that like I did in 2 seconds. And I think you should do that as an artist because, one of the ideas is you're being kind of romantic in a way about art, meaning like, oh, well, would Da Vinci or Michelangelo or something have used lasso tool? And the answer would be like, yeah. Like, would Vermeer use the liquify tool to like fix something? Totally, right? we don't have to gatekeep ourselves to not use those things. Now, they can be used a little too much in place of actual drawing or actual knowledge. That's what you want to be careful of, right? You don't want to rely so much on the tools that if they weren't there, you would struggle a lot or struggle too much in theory. So, you know, it's a thin line, like a lot of things in life, right? It's kind of like a thin line to toe. Use those tools, you know, don't use them so much that you find them to be like a crutch, like that you have to use them. But then don't waste your time either. You know, if you can do a quick fix, then that's okay. Okay, so this is what we'll call a good way to think of this is basically one-to-one. So we crashed right at what I was going to call one-to-one. Again, an observational drawing, realistic, not really any design in theory. So all just kind of like a direct translation. Make that a little bit smaller. So I think what would be cool is let's actually kind of explore each of these rules, like big, medium, small, the center line idea, and then finally the simple versus complex. Let's try to like go through those and show some examples across the mask. And some of these examples are kind of built into design. That's sort of the point is we can instinctually do these ideas or execute these ideas. We can do it, you know, out loud, meaning like we can really say like, oh, I need to make this part simple and this part more complex. Because one thing I'm admiring right now in the mask is I feel like it has already some integration of that, like some parts that are simple versus complex, but we'll show a little bit side to side how that could be really important. Okay, so let's write the rules again. So there's simple versus complex. This is across sides. This is within a field, right? When I say field, I mean like this, like even within this area, you know, we might have areas that are simple versus complex. The other way of calling this, saying this out loud is kind of like rest versus chaos. Chaos is kind of a strong word, but I like that because, again, design should be kind of pushed in theory, or it'd be like kind of really, you know, strong and readable. So it's cool to have moments that feel kind of chaotic and then juxtapose those with rest. So we have simple, complex. We have the center line. It's an important part of design, like show or imply some kind of center so that when you're rotating the object, you can see that rotation. And at the same time, also there's just what we call a visual cue. There's like a cue that I can see the volume of the piece. And I'm actually going to change my window just a little bit. Oh, and I see you in here, Kayleen. We are not actually. Yeah, for us, we're continuing our. So my student Kaylee, of course, in the chat. We're continuing the street fashion. We're wrapping that up. Props is actually something I'm doing in another class of mine, and then it kind of brought up this idea of like talking about item design. But this is cool because you could actually apply some of this even to your figure, possibly. These are design rules. I'm happy to use an item as an analogy. So center line, and then the last one. Big, medium, small. Yeah, and I'm glad you asked that question. I was just moving my my drawing window, that way I could see the chat a little bit better. So yeah, then the last rule, big, medium, small. Okay, so how do we apply these to this item separately and then even possibly pull them together, like POOL, I kind of put them all together. So let's first talk about simple versus complex. Simple versus complex is usually a sides or sections kind of idea. So meaning like top versus bottom, left versus right. A kind of like technical word, but like an important word that I often think about would be this is a very binary decision, meaning like it's this or that. Like you kind of make, you know, this choice or that choice. And so simple complex would be how do we make decisions across this mask? So let's start with left and right. One thing that I think a lot about in the left and right of this, and the whole point again is we're about to push, we're going to kind of push the reality, is I would like personally to see the left side be more simple and the right side be a little more complex. So as an example, here's the eyes. Here's the nose. And I'm kind of subtly pushing a little bit right now. I mean, like I'm going to kind of exaggerate this as I keep going. And we're doing some sketches before we do like a little bit, probably like a little more polished one. Let's move this down just a little bit. I like your question, by the way, Kayleen, because I can, rightfully, you can imagine like, oh, is this like a hint for what we're doing in class? So yeah, we're still continuing our project from last week, but this definitely applies. Like, you definitely would want to use some of this. Okay, so simple, complex. One of the first things I would say to myself is, you know, left to right. So left side, right side. Even though both sides have the ridges, so they both have this idea on the top, that kind of sunray idea. What would be kind of cool is to chill out one side or the other so that I'm giving that contrast across left and right, and then more importantly, I'm kind of pushing my viewer a little bit so that they're not confused. They're not kind of looking here and looking here, but that one side's more dominant. Usually what I try to think about in a 3/4 view is whatever side the object's looking at. This could even be like a coffee mug or like a loaf of bread, as I say, right? It could be anything where the item's kind of pointing at one side in the 3/4. That's the side, in theory, in my opinion, that should be more complex, because that's the narrative side. That's almost like the front of the piece, right? This is, in theory, kind of like a back, right, to this whole view going in 3/4. So the version of this, or like the visual, would be, here's my keystone. I'm going to do the 6 again, so like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. But what I'm going to do now is, instead of kind of peaking each one of these, I'm going to like soften that a lot. I'm going to basically kind of queen the shape like that, and then still do the bumps, but make them a little bit softer. And then over here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, I'm going to do the opposite. I'm actually going to kind of pump that shape a little bit more. Now, you don't want to do this in an inaccurate way, meaning like, oh, I don't want to do this so severely that these don't look like the same elements on either side. So that's why it's subtle. So instead of like dipping up and down really hard, I'm just sort of softening the blow, as we would say, right? I mean, like, I'm kind of just like toning down how that looks. And here I'm going to take some of my sketch away so you can really see it. So I describe this like a leaf. I talked about this in the class where I was doing this lecture, where, you know, a leaf could have serrated edges, I mean, like kind of sharp edges. And this does not have a decision for simple versus complex. This is just one type of side on both ends. And so it's low contrast, I mean, like it's less interesting. So what you'd want to do is you'd want to do something like this, where you say, okay, this leaf or this species does have a serrated edge, like that. I'm gonna go a little more round. But when I come over here, let me kind of clean that a little bit, and then just sort of hint at those edges. So then this would be the complex, this would be the simple. Here's your center line. And so that's the same thing we're doing over here. This is simple. We'll write on there, simple. Complex. I chose this because of the narrative. Again, like this is where things point, so it kind of makes more sense this should be complex. And then the other thing that I was really attracted to is that this eye, like this ring, kind of breaks the silhouette, whereas this one's sort of inside the silhouette. Of course, reminding ourselves silhouette's just the outside shape. So this one sits inside. This one actually breaks out of it a little bit. So all the more reason to make this kind of the complex side. So I'm going to keep that up. I'm going to say, okay, let me draw the eye in there. Here's like the back part of the eye. And notice how now that breaks the silhouette a little bit. I could go even further, and when I'm doing this mouth, I could have the lips break a little bit of the silhouette. You can push things, right? It's like maybe I actually even push or exaggerate that the cheek's coming in. So I get those little pops. I want to bring up formally, by the way, that I'm drawing on Clip Studio. And I'm doing that because it supposedly streamed faster, although it crashed just now, earlier. But yeah, also it's a little bit new to me. Like I've used Clip Studio a lot, but I've never used it like full on or seriously, like in a really like hardworking context. So all that to say, like, even I'm kind of feeling my way around a little bit, like these brushes and some of my flow. So any of my errors, I'm gonna blame on that. I was just bringing that because I was saying to myself, oh, I like this pencil. It's like a little bit crusty compared to one I use on Photoshop, but I do kind of like it. Okay, so there's some breaks there. Let's actually, speaking of that, I'm gonna kind of screenshot this along the way in case I get another crash, even rather than like saving the file. Okay, there's a little screenshot. Okay, so now let's acknowledge the interior of this. Again, we're gonna kind of keep these all sketch style so we can get through the rules. And then if I have a second, I'll do a little bit like a render on one. Okay, so simple complex for the sides. Let's grab some red. And let me even grab like a little bit of a thicker one. Let's see. Here we go. This checks for good. Yeah, okay, so we can see here cleaner, simple, more complex. More complex on the ridges. We get the break right there. We get the little break in the lip. You know, again, my argument would be I should even bring in this chin part a little. So we get the little break like that. So simple, complex, pushing this a little bit. And the point of design is that you're oftentimes pushing, as we said, meaning you're kind of slightly shifting things. You can go kind of like really crazy or like really take these rules and you know, throw them like really hard into the design. But otherwise, you know, again, we could just say, hey, like this is a slight push. A really fast alternate too I want to put on here would be the spacing of those objects. So for instance, if I did something like this and I drew the shape of the mask, and if I wanted like a simple top and a complex bottom, instead of putting things kind of towards the middle, right? Because this mask is stretched out a little bit, but instead of kind of like having things even, you know, one thing I could do is I could exaggerate the simple complex by pushing these items, these elements lower, kind of like crunching them up more, which would result in this feeling a lot more complex down here. We're overlapping even a little bit with big, medium, small, but we'll get to that in a second. And then what I would argue is even with those ridges, I mean, like the little sun rays up there, that concept, they're again like kind of like toning that down, you know, kind of like acknowledging it, but not going too crazy with line art or design on it. So then what that would look like now, again, would be simple, complex in this way. We have complex down here, we have simple up here. What is your decision? Meaning like, oh, like what are you going to do or what are you trying to do? One of the whole points of this discussion is to have decision, like to be declarative. So meaning, you know, more than anything, we're just asking you, hey, don't just draw things one to one. Don't draw exactly like a photo because that's pure observation and there's no interpretation inside of that. And then if you wanted to design, you're like, well, I'm drawing this for a character. I'm putting this into a show, meaning like my type of like material or like story or something, right? And you want to push it a certain way. These are the ways you push. These are like the questions you're trying to answer. We ask ourselves, what is simple and complex across this whole shape? And the more you make those decisions, two things happen. There's better read. So meaning like you can see the item better, your audience can read it better. The decisions you're making inside of that just are stronger. So they take in, the audience takes your item or your drawing in stronger. And then additionally, you're creating contrast. And something I talked about when I was doing a lecture on this is that contrast is literally the core of art, right? We're gonna put that on here. You know, contrast, you know, is the core of art. You know, like it's the whole point of art. What that means is to see difference, to see like a difference of things, a difference, you know, if you have a blank sheet of paper, although in certain circles of the art market, this is a piece of artwork to certain people, like the taping the banana to the wall kind of people. You can look that up on your own for clarification. But to take a piece of paper, and as soon as you do this, you have created art technically because you've created contrast. You've created a difference. In this field of white, you have a mark or a positive and negative space that's being engaged. So contrast is color. Contrast is value, light and dark. Contrast is, again, small and large, right? As soon as you put a little person on something and like a large person, you've created a contrast, like a giant or a creature, right? And so the whole point of seeing things is that we create some kind of difference. So that's what you're trying to do also, like to make a design where you're possibly trying to make something different or push it or make something new. That's what you are pushing, is you're pushing contrast, difference. Okay, and so to number these two, let's say this is rule number 1, right? A lot of this is simple versus complex. Rule number 2, actually not too hard because it's in the design, which is very chill. Like it's like built into the design of this mask. And so we'll kind of do this one as a little mini one. So here is our egg shape. Honestly, you could do kind of a ball and jaw style with this, right? You kind of do a little ball and then a jaw like that coming down. I'm kind of interested in like pushing this, like almost like pushing a jaw like that. So I might play with that in a second on the big meme small discussion. But yeah, center line would be, you know, we establish an actual center. It's very important on this one because it dips, right? There's like a dip in the middle, which is very, very nice for the volume. Here's one eye. Here's again that cool eye that's kind of like skewed. Here's the lips. What you're going to notice also is that by doing iterations, right, like multiple drawings and like trying to figure out the design, you yourself are going to make better designs because you're doing that very action. You're iterating. You're doing different versions of it. So that means you're going to each time make better decisions in theory, or more importantly, kind of shift your decisions a little bit, you know, between strong and weak decisions. Weak in the sense of like, is this a good read? Is this effective? Okay, so center line, again, is literally built into the mask, which is very cool. Because not only is there a nose, but there's also this ridge. There's this ridge right here that gives the shape volume. There's a keystone, right, that gives the shape volume. And then we would argue like the nose. Even though this is stationary, so I mean like this is literally a mask, so that means like the eyes have to stay the same. Okay, a pin fell on my leg, and I was like, what was that? Even though I don't know why that's falling. Even though the mask is going to stay, it's not like a face. It doesn't like shift, or the mouth, you know, and things like that don't have any movement necessarily. We don't really either as people. But that said, you know, measuring the center off of like the spacing in the eyes is doable, but more importantly, we're trying to find like actual things in the center. And for me, this is what I call cues, like C-U-E. You know, this is probably like the best cue. We'd put on there like the best cue for the center line, or the CL. So just seeing this, you know, when I go and I rotate the mask, so like when I do another view of the mask, and I do something like this, and it's turned like more towards profile, then when I put that thing in the center like that, you know, I can obviously start to see the 3-dimension of this thing spinning. So it's right there. You know, if I were to even like turn it almost like really skewing the perspective, like it's sort of looking down on it. Something kind of like that. Then again, seeing this center ridge, here's like the keystones. Seeing that ridge will really give me two things again, the perspective, right? And then the volume being really important. So there it is there. There it is there. So it's a center to the piece that helps with volume and then gives the item more dimension. So, and again, there's multiple ones on here in theory. There's actually the keystone, the center thing built into the mask, and then probably like the bridge of the nose would be a good one as well. So these would be like 3. And one thing that's really cool is, of course, if you have multiple things, then you can use those to line up the center even better. We use this a lot on character, because we'd have, you know, a character. So let's say we have a person. They're wearing a shirt. Especially like, let's say the shirt had like a collar. Yeah, let's actually put that a little bit better there. So here's their neck. Let's say they have a shirt with a collar. The shirt has buttons, right? Here's their arm. Looks like a little tentacle arm. Here's their belt, right? Even without buttons, right, like a line down a shirt for buttons, what's cool is that we have multiple cues for the center of the character. We have this, you know, like where their collar would kind of finish into the center of their neck, right? And then we have their belt. And so these are the two cues. And when the character is turning, we can see their volume really well by that. So then as soon as we see this, we see, you know, the center of the shirt and the belt, you know, down here. That's telling us the center of the character. And then, of course, there could even be conflict in a cool way, right? There could be, you know, the collar looking one way, like the character's turning their head or their upper body one way. And then the belt could be their waist turned it another way for twist. So then you get things like that. So those are cues, C-U-E, right? Find your cues. These are visual cues to kind of show the volume. And one important thing would be, on something like the leaf, this is what we'd argue as well, that if we had the silhouette of the leaf like that and like that, these are both flat right now. They're both very two-dimensional, very graphic, which is cool, right? We could say, hey, the shape at least is there. But then as soon as we do this, we change the piece completely. This one has volume. If we do this, this one's turning the other way, right? They're turning towards one another. Or if we do things like this, we'd even say, hey, not bad, but kind of flat, right? Like that doesn't have as much volume. But yeah, as soon as we add that center line, we could even change literally the orientation, meaning like how they face one another. And a really good example of this too is fingers, because you have your finger right here. So here's your finger. Here's another one. So those are just fingers, meaning like those are just shapes. But as soon as you do this, as soon as you take the same shape, the same silhouette, and you add a nail to it, right? You give those shapes a center. You give them now a twist or a turn. And that's all because of that one cue, that one like symbol changed completely how these things are facing. So center line. And probably an even better term, because I genuinely just sort of like came up with that as a catch-all term, would probably be cue. Center cue. And then this is wonderful, my favorite, because it's playing into alliteration, my absolute favorite thing in the world, right? Like anything that has the same, like, you know, start to the word, right? So center cue is probably a little bit easier to remember, a little bit more accurate as well, because it's not always just a line. You know, it could be an element. And the point is it's making a line, or it's making an axis, like it's here again to show this. It's making, you know, a turn in things, but it's not always a line. You know, on the leaf it is, right? That's kind of obvious. It's a line. But oftentimes it's a cue. It's a symbol or something that we're adding to the drawing to give it that dimension. Okay, and I could tell my time's going pretty well. Like we're at about 40 minutes, so I think for the most part, I'm just going to get to some drawings. I don't know if I'll get to paint or anything. But let's go ahead and do our final rule, big, medium, small. So this is rule number 2. So big, medium, small. Okay, now with big, medium, small, what I find particularly important is, although that's a proportion in theory, one of the more important things that I talk about a lot with figure drawing and even just drawing in general would be parts. Like, okay, well, what are you going to make big, medium, small? Because this mask, if it was being worn by a figure, that could be a relationship, right? Like how big is the mask compared to the figure? You know, big, medium, small. And then within the mask itself, we have to kind of decide what's big, medium, small. And so part of that is in a very genuine, like kind of checklist style way, asking ourselves, okay, what are these pieces that I can play with, quote unquote? Like what can I kind of push or stretch into this shape? So the first thing I'll do is I'll say, okay, well, what is big, medium, small? Unfortunately for like a good read, this is not necessarily big, medium, small, right? So that, although these have differences, here I'm gonna put that one on the ground. So although there's a 1, 2, 3 here, you know, we put kind of like a slow or kind of like dissatisfied expression, meaning like, okay, like, and I'm not really jazzed. That's not a huge difference. If you want things to have really big read and contrast, this is big, medium, small, right? Is things like that. And that's pretty wild, or that's, you know, like I could even make this one a little bit more like that. So I'll just say like, yeah, this is a pretty big, medium, small. And on a technical level, because I know I care about things like this, so here's 1, 2, 3. On a technical level, one way to think of it would be, you know, I could fit 3 of these into the next size. I could fit even 3 of these possibly into this next size. So I mean like a third or like 30%, whatever you want to think of it as numerically. But the idea being like there could be up to that big of a difference. That like between big, medium, small, it's like an entire third or like 2/3 difference in size. That's big, medium, small. Like that's a read, right? So an example with the mask again would be, okay, let's find first the elements we're dealing with. And I'm already kind of like riffing on this a little bit more, meaning, you know, now that I've been drawing it, I want to see these pieces I can play with. Here's a center ridge. Here's those side ones. This is a quick little survey, so let's just say it like that. Okay. And I keep wanting to like dip that, but I think deep down it does look better. It's just like a point like that. I keep thinking like a little dip to acknowledge like a cheek would make sense, but not really, especially for like a mask. A mask should be pretty uniform, so I stand corrected on that. And it'd be really accurate to the original one. We notice that this eye is a lot higher. This is the one that's a little bit lower. Okay, now mentally or kind of like, you know, within ourselves, we can make this list, we can measure this out, but let's also kind of checklist a little bit. I mean, like, what are some of the things I can play with on here? I can shift around. So we'd probably say the ridges. So that's 1. That center line, like kind of how prominent or even how wide it is, 2. The eyes, right? So we'll circle those, like the eyes. That's 3. The nose, you know, that's like 4. The lips are 5. And then it's really fair to say like the mask itself, right? Kind of like the whole thing itself is 6, like the whole shape. Now, big, medium, small is 3 elements or 3 types of variable, right? So we don't have to get too mathematical. I mean, like, I'm not trying to make a division like 3 divided by 6, etc., right? But the point would be, hey, here's a bunch of things I can stretch. What would I find most important to stretch in this? One thing that is especially important when you're stretching or pushing in style would be to have some respect probably for the original piece. So I can see it on my screen, but let's go back up here for a second. So one thing that stands out to me, probably the reason I picked this mask to draw and kind of experiment and investigate, is because I did really like the eyes. I liked how big they were. And then more importantly, I liked how they had that skew, that they're kind of like off-center in theory. So that could be one of the biggest things I think about as a large element. I mean, like kind of to parallel those two words, like what's the biggest thing? Possibly these big eyes, because I like that that's a big part of this narrative. That's a large part of the story of this mask is these large eyes. And I speak of that only in the connotation of like the visual, me looking at it versus the actual story, of course, like possibly within it. So we're going to take this, I'll move it over a little bit. So let's experiment a little bit. If I had the whole shape of the mask, so here's the kind of long egg. Again, one of the first things I tell myself is to try to be careful of this, to be careful of just dividing this thing into pieces. Now, speaking of terms, I never really have like a great term for this, but I often refer to it as real estate, meaning like, you know, don't have things occupy the same type of real estate. Don't put these in the middle so that there's stuff up here and stuff here, because then that's also so evenly spaced. And the argument in theory would be like, yeah, that's not contrast, right? Anytime we're getting closer to even, anytime we're trying to get closer to this, you know, the plus sign would be low contrast. you know, put on their low contrast. So I need to make sure I break that up. So there again, like process or like kind of steps, I would say, you know, let me try to do that element now so I can make everything smaller around it, right? And I often talk about this when I discuss like a giant, like a creature or like a giant or something. That's kind of ironic that sometimes we say to ourselves, oh yeah, I want to make this like huge character. So I want to make like, they have a big head, they have like a big body, you know, they have like, let's say like a big belly or something, right? They have big hands. And the funny thing is this is not actually as large as a character like this with a small head. Like now this is a giant, right? Small head, huge body. You know, sometimes even depending on the style of what you're doing, small hands make the body look huge, right? Or you could do kind of a Wreck-It Ralph, meaning like you almost just like straight down go into the hands, right? Something kind of like that. But yeah, the funny thing would be a smaller head. So making something small is what makes something look bigger. That refers to also a kind of like different method of thinking, meaning like, how do I make something bigger? And there's a positive, meaning like kind of like a forward moving idea, which would be, oh yeah, let me keep making it bigger. Let me make the head bigger, the body bigger, things like that, right? And then there's this reverse kind of engineering would say, well, how do I make something look big? The answer also could be make everything else around it smaller. I talk about this with highlights a lot, right? Or even like shadows when people are trying to do bright highlights on a thing that's bright. And it's like, I can't make it more white. Like, how do I make this read correctly? And of course, the reverse thinking would be, well, make things slightly darker around it. Like start making everything slightly darker in the image so that the white actually pops out. So same thing here. Let me make this big element, and then to really sell it as being large or bigger, let me go ahead and make lots of things kind of smaller, push them a little bit smaller. So that idea for me, I'm gonna make this a little bit bigger. So I'm actually reaching my time, so I think I'll probably call it on just explaining the rules. If I have some time extra, I'll do a little mask drawing and maybe I'll post it. So let me start by saying, okay, I'd like the eyes to be large on this piece. And then instead of acknowledging a lot of those sizes from the original, let me try to make things a little bit smaller. And again, this is push. So this is meant to be something that's different than what I see, especially when I'm trying to work on a design inspired by this. I mean, like if I wanted to do a design that is this concept of the mask but different, this is where I could build. I could say, okay, I want the really large eyes. And to be honest, I love the skew, so I think I'd even want to put this a little bit more like off center, kind of like off the, not only skewed like this, but also like kind of stretching out really far. And then if I were to take a lot of the original design, I would just make it smaller. So I'd say, okay, let me make this part smaller. That really nice brow kind of dip right here. There again, center. Let me make the ridge smaller. And then even the mouth. Let me make that a little bit smaller. Still trying to respect the ratios. Like the kind of like relationship within those items, but then kind of overall toning down, compared to the eye, toning down the size comparison. So the eyes would be the biggest thing. I'm gonna move this a little bit because it's a little skewed, a little too skewed. Right there again, like it's a fine line to break, meaning like to push or break, but then don't do it so much that you have now created a broken idea. I mean, like, oh, this is too far. This is reading is broken. It's no longer just exaggeration. It's incorrect in theory, right? And then let's go ahead and make a quick little idea of the ridges. So there's one kind of push, right? Especially when you look all the way back from over here. There's one kind of push for bigger eyes. Let's kind of thumbnail a few more to wrap up the day. Move that over a little bit. Screenshot, in case this goes kablooey. Okay, so large eyes, smaller features. Let's say it was about the, let's say like one of the things I was wanting to stress is more the shape, like kind of like the big, you know, really powerful top to this mask. So maybe I would do something like this, where I'd make the jaw part, right, a little bit smaller. I would kind of push everything smaller down here and like crunch it a little bit more. And then maybe I did like a really big center ridge. Maybe like a really big keystone, right? Go a little bit simpler on this side. More complex. Sticks out more on the silhouette. Small jaw, right? Small top. Or excuse me, small bottom, and then a really large top. So we could do something like that. Now, one of the last things I'd like to end this discussion on would be one of the best ways to design off of pre-existing art, right? Because this is pre-existing art. And although there can be a respect in designing from it, I mean, like kind of using it, there's also a important idea about narrative, that like you want to keep these stories separate. I might like this mask and I might want to use it in a story of mine or with a character of mine, but without having a full context for this mask, that would be sometimes unfair to overlap those ideas, right? Because there might be a story or a narrative that's very different than what I'm going to use it within in my own work. So what you want to do then, to wrap that up, and I'm going to put that here, like how to use art, especially, right? Because that's what a lot of like costume and mask and things like that are, is they really do fall under the category of art. So how to use art would be, again, take the theory. Take the theory of what you see. So as an example, I would say, you know, the theory of this mask would be, you know, large eyes, open mouth, you know, like a interesting, like kind of like a bend, like a dip in volume, you know, or face. And then I even put on here like ridged silhouette. Silhouette. That's one of those, everyone's got a word that catches them. That one catches me. I always have to say silhouette to spell it out correctly. So, and the cool thing would be, this is a better way to design, inspired from this mask, when you start to riff on it, right? You start to kind of like change it or do things with it uniquely. This is a better way to design. And then also part of the responsibility as an artist then would be, this is very thoughtful. Like you're actually very thoughtfully thinking about the point of this mask visually, so that you're not caught up in a narrative that you don't understand, or that you in theory shouldn't use because it doesn't quite fall into the narrative you might be using it in. And again, you're being more thoughtful. You're saying like, why do I like this? Instead of just being like, wow, this is cool. Being like, I really like it because it is these ratios, or this combination, this juxtaposition of elements. Like, that's what's cool about it. You know, at the end of the day, I picked it because it's a skewed, large-eyed mask. That's the very core of what I wanted from it. So then I could change all kinds of things. I could change, you know, the shape of it. So I mean, like when I'm designing my original mask, it could be more like square. It could have, again, the exact thing I talked about, where I said, wow, I really like these skewed kind of like large eyes. You know, I like this dip. So I like that the center kind of like dips in there. Maybe mine has like holes. This is very symmetrical, right? So let me do something that has more thought. Maybe some idea like that, where it's acknowledging a chin. I do like the small chin, right? There's a very small, kind of like thin chin. So there again, I could say, oh yeah, let me incorporate that. There's kind of like this nice open mouth. It's getting very alien, right? Which makes sense because of the eyes. Maybe I don't give like a top lip to mine. Maybe it just has like a little triangle like that. And then ridged silhouette, which could mean, yeah, I kind of like this sun ray idea. There's kind of like these ridges to it. And this could be the start of something I'm designing originally. And the cool thing is I'm literally looking at that reference picture the entire time, or like during my design process. And it's informing me, but I'm being informed by the theory. I'm being informed by the concept of it, especially because without doing really deep research and incorporating that research into the piece itself, I only stopped on it because of its visuals. So then let me stick to that. Let me stick to the idea that it's the visuals that got me here in the first place that attracted me to it. So I should extrapolate just the visuals, extrapolate the theory behind it, and then go ahead and use that as the inspiration for an original piece or for when I'm trying to push it. But yeah, I hope this was helpful to talk about design, to talk about props. I'd love to, again, every Wednesday basically do some streams like this. If you watch the entire thing, thanks for weathering the little blip with the program crashing. I'll be back next week. I'll choose a new topic to do a little bit of a tutorial and some thoughts on. Go have a good rest of your day. If you're watching the replay, thanks so much. I will see you guys later. See ya.